Science of the Gaps podcast, and we're very proud and excited to welcome Jan Holden to the podcast today. I'm just going to give a bit of background information on Jan. She's got a lot going on in her CV, so I've condensed it down into a few essentials. So after earning her Doctor of Education degree in Counselor Education in 1988, Dr. Holden served 31 years at the University of North Texas Counseling Program faculty. Dr. Holden's primary research focus has been near-death experiences, after-death communication, and other transpersonal experiences, those that transcend the usual personal limits of space-time and identity. Dr. Holden currently serves as president of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, and since 2008, she has served as editor-in-chief of that association's peer-reviewed scholarly journal of near-death studies. Whew. It's a lot there. Is there anything else, anything I've missed, or anything you would add to that, do you think?
Oh gosh, I can't think of anything right now. I think things will come out as we talk today. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
No
We
problem.
haven't done a podcast for about a year, and the last time we did one, we spoke to Dr. Jeffrey Long,
Mhm.
um, and a lot came out of that. So it's really good to kind of get going again and welcome you today. So thank you for coming. How are you
Yeah.
doing? How's that's a kind of resume of your background. What's the current state of play? Is there anything interesting and exciting going on now?
Oh gosh. Well, as you said, I'm serving as president of IANS, and so that's a big job. The organization is huge and sprawling, and it's almost all volunteers, and there's just a lot going on. We do an annual conference and an annual online symposium, and have regular meetings and all kinds of activities. So that takes a lot of time. Editing the journal takes a lot of time. And I'm right now on a research team at the University of Virginia, and we're collecting cases of veridical after-death communication. So this is where people had the experience of communicating with a deceased person. I mean, it can include an animal, but it's hard to have a veridical one with an animal because in a veridical one, the deceased person provides information that the living person couldn't have known through normal means, and then is later verified as accurate. And so we're collecting cases like that. And otherwise, I mean, I'm just involved in research and writing, and I'll be teaching my course, graduate course at University of North Texas again in the spring on the transpersonal perspective in counseling, and that is about how near-death experiences, after-death communication, past life memories, telepathy, precognition, psychokinesis, remote viewing, all those kinds of things relate to the field of counseling. So it's my absolute favorite thing to do to teach that class. And when the students write their anonymous feedback at the end of the class, it's not unusual for them to start their feedback by saying, "This course changed my life." And as a teacher, there's no better phrase that a teacher can hear than that. Of course, changed in a positive way. So yeah, I've got lots of balls in the air.
Great. And you sound as passionate as ever. So it's really great to hear that excitement and enthusiasm.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's still so much to do.
Yeah. How did
Yeah,
but the conference was fairly recently, is that right? Was that like last
that's
month?
right.
Yeah.
Just
How
a
did that
couple
go?
of weeks ago. Oh, it was a roaring success on so many levels. It was well organized. The programming was great. The speakers, um, the venue was this wonderful resort in Arizona. And it might sound really bad to be in Arizona during our Labor Day weekend, the end of August, beginning of September, the hottest time of the year. But we were completely indoors the whole time, and it's just the most wonderful venue. We're going to be going back there for future conferences, and we even had a record-shattering level of donations during the conference. So just in every way, it was just a huge success. And I think the most important thing is there is something about the energy of people getting together who have had near-death experiences, who are interested or related experiences, as I said, like after-death communication and so forth, and who are interested in these phenomena and the meaning that they have for our lives. I reunited with a student at the conference just very briefly, and actually we didn't have time to talk hardly at all at the conference, so we got together for coffee after we got back here to North Texas. And she said that the moment she grasped the door to the hotel, this energy surged into her, and she said it remained with her the whole weekend. And we got together about a week later, and she said she was still feeling the after effects of this energy. So there's just something energetic, like a higher energy kind of thing with that conference. I always look forward to it.
Sounds wonderful. And
Yeah.
obviously, with the benefit of being in the field for decades now, would you say there's a sense of momentum and increased interest over those years?
Yes, absolutely. The field opened in 1975 with Raymond Moody's book Life After Life. And in that book, he coined the term near-death experience. And it really opened the field of near-death studies. And since then, there's been just burgeoning research and publication. I mean, when the field began back in the late 70s, there was no place to publish research about near-death experiences, and mainstream journals were not accepting manuscripts on the topic because it was just considered so, woo-woo. But the Journal of Near-Death Studies legitimized the phenomena, and now there are uh, many, many respected journals that have published research, and lots of books, lots of near-death experiencers coming forward, and being able to do so now with an understanding of what happened to them, and a sense that they're not crazy, that they're uh, the experience is spiritually benevolent rather than being demonic in some way, and they're and just that the experience has meaning and value in their lives. So all this good stuff has been happening to a great extent because of IANS, really legitimizing the phenomenon of near-death experiences as just something legitimate.
Thank you. Well,
Mhm.
we have our own near-death experiencer as part of the as my co-host here, Sandy. Sandy, have you got any questions or anything you'd like to ask?
Well, we actually got some questions from people on the near-death experience sub, and I think it would be nice to go into those. Jan and I have talked before, and maybe some of those questions will bring up more ideas for me to ask about.
Yeah, that sounds
Great.
good.
Yep. Is that okay, Jan?
Fine.
So straight into the questions.
Was I supposed to write them down? I thought Roman was going to be doing
Well,
that.
I have
Ramen.
some
It's the yeah,
Oh,
ramen.
okay.
Yeah. Sorry, put you on the spot there.
um all right. So uh a gnome in disguise asks, Dr. Jan Holden, what is your opinion on the hypothesis that consciousness might be equivalent to all of reality?
Consciousness equivalent to all reality. I don't think I've ever thought in exactly those terms. But what I can say is that I definitely subscribe to the worldview that consciousness is fundamental and is really the fundamental source or phenomenon of the universe, and that everything, both material and transmaterial, is a manifestation of consciousness. So, so I definitely believe that, and I, on a related note, I along with that, I believe that, or I guess I would say that I have a personal conviction. I know that consciousness is not produced by the brain, that while we're alive, our consciousness and our brain are very closely interconnected. And I believe that I know that our consciousness existed prior to this physical life and will continue to exist after this body has met its demise. So, so I've reached that conclusion both through studies and through personal experience.
I guess what the questioner is thinking about is like, do you find the idea that consciousness might be equivalent to all of reality plausible?
Well, again, it's a little hard for me to think in those terms exactly, that consciousness is equivalent to all reality. I guess I would agree with that because I believe that consciousness is fundamental to all phenomena. So maybe we're saying the same thing in different terms.
All right, cool. Another question from Short Reaction is, what's the thing that convinced you that NDEs are a real phenomenon and not just a at-death hallucination?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Well, from the very beginning of my study of NDEs, I was fascinated by this phenomenon of veridical perception, where during the NDE, the person perceives something. It could be in the material world or in the transmaterial domain that involves information that the experiencer couldn't have known through normal means. And is later verified as accurate. So I can give you a couple of examples of that if you'd like. These examples are collected in a book called The Self Does Not Die. And the subtitle is Verified Paranormal Phenomena from Near-Death Experiences.
Titus Rivas.
Pardon me?
Titus Rivas, was it?
Yes, that's right. Titus Rivas. And two co-authors. And so one of the cases there, and these cases are especially evidential when they were reported by a credible third party. And in many cases, this is the physician who was attending a person during a medical crisis when they had their NDE. And the information either is not among their expectations or actually contradicts their expectations. So they learn something that's different than what they would have expected, and yet it turns out to be correct. So one case is a woman who is in surgery and she unexpectedly flatlines. Her heart stops beating. So the surgical team is scurrying around trying to resuscitate her. Meanwhile, she leaves her body. She's observing from above the ceiling, and she tells, she sees some things that I'll tell you about in a minute. But they finally get her heart started again. Of course, this whole time she's completely anesthetized, and how they cover the body and they tape the eyes shut and all that kind of stuff, all that remained the same. So They got her heart going again. They finish the surgery. They take her to post-op. She regains consciousness. Her surgeon comes to check on her, and she says, I know that I died during the surgery. And he's like, what? Like, how could you think that? And she said, well, I saw you all running around and trying to get my heart started again. And you were doing this, and he was standing here. And she explained everything accurately about what all was happening while
Is
her
that
body was essentially dead.
is that the case of Pam Reynolds that you're referring?
No, this is a different one. Um, and she said, I was actually up, I left my body and I was up above the ceiling. I was looking through the ceiling at this, and I could also see through the walls. And in the operating room next door, they were amputating a man's leg. And when they amputated the leg, they put it in a yellow plastic bag to dispose of it. So the surgeon said he was interviewed, and the interview used to be online, but it's disappeared. But we still have his the transcript of the interview. And he said, I had no idea what they were doing in this operating room next to me. But he said now it was a few hours after the surgery. So I went back to the hospital records and discovered that, in fact, while I was operating on this woman, they were amputating a man's leg next door. And he said, I'd never been in that operating room because it was specialized for amputation. I don't do amputations. But now, a few hours later, that I could see that room was empty. So I went and poked my head inside, and there I saw the yellow plastic bags that they use to dispose of amputated body parts. So she saw things that even her surgeon had no knowledge of, and was later, he verified it as accurate. So that's one in the material world, where the person perceives something in the material world. And a case in the transmaterial world is a person, this is a story from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she was on call one day and called in because a boy had been in a bad car accident, and he arrived at the hospital unconscious. And what she learned was that his mother had died in the accident itself, but his brother had survived but had very bad burns. So they had taken him to a different hospital in that city where they specialized in treating burns. And so she's treating this boy, and he regains consciousness. And she says, how are you? And he said, I'm fine. He said, my mother and my brother are waiting for me. And then he loses consciousness, and a couple minutes later, he dies. Now she's thinking, okay, he must be hallucinating, or he doesn't know, that his brother's still alive. So she leaves the room. She walks past the nurse's station. The nurse is on the phone, and she says, oh, Dr. Kubler-Ross, this is a call from the hospital where your patient's brother is. They want to talk with you. She hands her the phone, and they say, we just wanted to let you know that the brother of your patient died about an hour and a half ago. And so at the time that her patient had the experience, whatever experience it was that he reported, his brother had died. So the brother and the mother were indeed waiting for him in the, quote unquote, afterlife. So there again, he had information that contradicted anything that anybody at that hospital knew. So so these cases are and you'll notice that I use the word case rather than anecdote, because the word anecdote kind of diminishes the evidential value. It's like this kind of weird happening. But these are, every case in this book has been researched to the extent possible to verify its validity and accuracy. And in many cases, the authors actually did follow-up communication with the person who had originally reported the case. So there's a lot of verification involved there. And there are over 130 cases in there. And so I conducted, well, so this is one avenue for confirming the quote unquote objective reality of near-death experiences, because as you implied, Rahman, most of these experiences are completely subjective and there's nothing in them that could be verified. But there are these cases that involve things that can be. So one of the ways to pursue that is to collect the cases and really keep only the ones that are really solid, evidentially solid. And there are a lot of them that also involve veridical perception, but they're not, the evidence for one reason or another isn't really solid. But we have like over 120, I'm sorry, I misspoke, over 120 cases like this. The other avenue is to do a prospective study in hospital to try to capture somebody having a near-death experience during cardiac arrest and having a visual target planted in the room above eye level but facing the ceiling, because most near-death experiencers report that their consciousness is located at or above the ceiling, looking down. And so having the target face up, our hope is that somebody pops out of their body as they're looking down, they see the visual target and think that's weird. But then when they are resuscitated and we go in and ask, what do you remember from your experience? And that's all we ask, a very open-ended question. Of course, we know from research that 80 to 90% of people are going to say they don't remember anything, but 10 to 20% will report a near-death experience where their consciousness was functioning apart from their physical body, observing the material world and or observing and interacting with transmaterial entities and environments. I did the first of these studies back in the mid 1980s at Lutheran General Hospital in Park Ridge, Illinois. I was teamed up with the hospital chaplain there. And we conducted the study for over a year, and we never captured an NDE. And to make a much longer story, much shorter, there have been, I think, a total of 7 attempts, different kinds of methodology, but all in the hospital, all working with people who went into cardiac arrest and were resuscitated, all involving hidden visual targets of various types. And none of them has captured an NDE under those controlled circumstances. During those studies, there have been other veridical near-death experiences, but they just haven't been the ones where the person saw the visual and later reported the visual target. So we're still searching for that really kind of airtight evidence. Sandi, you have a question?
Yes, I was just going to kind of ask if you have had any opportunities under any circumstances really to talk to a doctor who has had someone verify something for them.
Oh,
And
yes.
the reason that I ask that is because there's a lot of like, well, how do we know that they even researched those that are in that book? How do we know that the person
Right.
just didn't tell them the story and they just accepted it? So, what are your
Right.
thoughts on that, if you would?
Well, first of all, I mean, questioning the integrity of the authors is just about the last effort to discredit something. But I have spoken with some of those physicians. In fact, I have a really great memory of having lunch with Tom Ofterhide, who's a physician in Wisconsin. And when he was an intern, he was being supervised because he was new. And one day, a man was brought into the hospital in cardiac arrest, and his supervisors were tied up in other things. So he was on his own, and he was thinking to himself, oh my gosh, I like, what do I do? And he took care of the patient and did fine. But the patient was in coma, remained in coma, which isn't unusual after a cardiac arrest. And so the next day, Tom went to check on the patient, and he was there in his room, in his bed, in a coma. And just about that time, the meal people came and delivered the patient's lunch. And Tom had been on duty for almost 24 hours. He hadn't eaten anything. And he thought, this guy isn't going to eat the lunch. So he sat there for 5 minutes and ate the patient's lunch and then left. So a couple days later, the patient regains consciousness, and Tom goes in and he's checking on him, like, how are you and all that. And the guy says, you realize that you owe me a lunch. And Tom's like, what? And he said, I saw you. I saw you here a couple days ago eating that meal that they delivered. And he said, and also I knew when you were working on me when I first came in the hospital, how terrified you were because your supervisor wasn't around to help you. Now, this was a thought that he had had that he did not voice. You don't say to anybody, I don't know what I'm doing
I
here.
have no idea.
So the patient had heard his thought and seen him eat the lunch when the patient was unconscious. And so that Tom said, that's when I knew that, there's something more going on here. And he's still, to my knowledge, practicing. He was a couple of years ago when we met at the IONS conference and had our own lunch together. So that's just one example. Another is Bruce Grayson, who is the leading researcher in the field of near-death studies. And I can say that with authority that he is numero uno. And his introduction to near-death experiences occurred when he was also, he wasn't an intern because he was supervising. I can't remember, but anyway, he was on call one day. He was sitting in his kitchen eating spaghetti dinner, and his pager went off, and he had to stop what he was doing and go over to the hospital to check on this woman who had been brought in unconscious, had a suicide attempt. And when the pager went off, he jumped and he splattered spaghetti sauce on his tie. But because he was in a rush, to get over there, he just grabbed his lab coat, put it on, and buttoned it to cover up the stain. So he goes over, he examines this young woman, and the person who had accompanied her into the hospital was her college roommate, who was waiting in the waiting room, down the hall and quite some distance away. So after he finished examining the patient, he went down to talk with the roommate, and unconsciously, when he sat down, he unbuttoned his lab coat. Didn't really think about it. It's just something you do when you sit down. You unbutton your coat, to be more comfortable. So he interviews the roommate, finds out everything he can about the case, and then thanks her, and they say goodbye. So the patient remains in a coma for a couple of days and then wakes up. And so he goes in to check on her, and he asks her how he is. And he said, I spoke with your roommate. And she said, I know. You said this, and my roommate said that, and you said this, and my roommate said that. And he's like, how do you know that? And she said, well, I was there. I was in the room. I could see you and hear you having the conversation. And he said, really? And she said, yeah. And you had a stain on your tie. So she saw things that were, of course, he wasn't wearing that tie the day she woke up, and he went to check on her. It was only the day that she had been brought in unconscious. So, I've just talked with several physicians who've had this experience, and there's and you know if I guess if somebody questioned Bruce Grayson's integrity, I would really get on my high horse because he is just he's just one of the best human beings ever. And at the time, of course, he knew nothing. This was before the term near-death experience. It was before Moody's book. And so for him, it was just this anomalous experience that he didn't know how to make sense of and just kind of filed away until Raymond Moody became one of his supervisees, a medical doctor supervisor. And he learned from Raymond about near-death experiences and then went, oh, I had a patient who had that, and told the story. So yeah, I just, and all of the criticisms like, oh, maybe people misremembered, or maybe they got the information some other way. When you read one case after another, those attempts to explain them away just melt, because it's just impossible to imagine that, like there's another case where this person was in his hospital bed and not in surgery or anything, but he lost consciousness and had a near-death experience, left his body, floated up through the levels of the hospital. And the level right above, when he floated through, he's like, what is this? There were beds around and a circle of podiums with computers on them, and what looked like dummies. And he's like, what? But he floats on up through, and has the rest of his near-death experience. Well, when he regains consciousness, and says to the nurse what happened to him, the nurse, there were apparently a couple nurses, and they looked at each other like, how could he know that? Because above them was their training facility where they had mannequins that they did, like practice CPR and other kinds of stuff on them. And the podiums with the computers were for the supervising nurses to observe and take notes on how this nurse trainee was doing. And so it's a very idiosyncratic thing. And it's not like the nurses stand around and say, oh, meet me upstairs where we have the beds and the podium in a circle with the computers and the mannequins. I mean, people just don't talk about stuff like that. So it's just it just doesn't hold water to explain this number of cases away like that.
Yeah, I think you'd have to believe in a lot of conspiracy theories happening to explain these away.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we say here in Texas, bless their hearts.
Yes.
I'm curious what people in the face of the evidence, do people just put it in a box and say, well, maybe I don't know what to make of that as something, and then I'm just wondering whether it challenges people's core values, identity, and that sort of thing, and it's just kind of on ice for a bit.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and I've come to categorize people in three categories. One of my ways of categorizing people. There are people who've had these experiences, so they already know, and they don't need evidence. They've had their own personal evidence. On the other extreme are people who subscribe to philosophical materialism and believe that everything has a physical basis and that consciousness is a product of the brain. It did not exist before the brain existed, and it will not exist after the brain meets its demise. And then in the middle are people who are not sure. They're open, skeptical in the best sense of the word, like questioning the evidence and that sort of thing. Um, and when materialists encounter these data, they just explain them away by tricks of memory, that the person must have gotten the information in some way that they don't remember. Well, how many of us get information that we don't remember the source or have some sense of the source, like, oh, somebody was just telling me oh, yeah, it was, Jeff Long who mentioned this in a conversation the other day. If you've got 130 people who none of whom remember having been told this information, really? Uh,
Well, the
but
other one is lying. They like to tell
yeah.
me that I'm lying as well.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That you're seeking attention when actually most people until relatively recently, and even now it still happens, they've questioned their own sanity. Others have questioned their sanity. The experiences have been demonized, and so there's more disincentive to share the experience than incentive. And especially physicians, they are surrounded by philosophical materialists. So to talk about an experience that challenges that worldview is very risky. And so, for example, Jeff O'Driscoll is a physician he's an ER physician, and he recently retired. When he retired, he wrote a book about all the transpersonal experiences he had as an ER physician when he saw deceased loved ones of the patient that he was working on, and a lot of it was verified because there was a nurse who also was very telepathic, and they would kind of communicate with each other about things that were going on at a transmaterial level related to the ER. He had good reason to wait until he retired to write his book and disclose what he'd been experiencing, because his credibility would have been questioned. But in my view, absolutely unfounded. But nevertheless, that's it. So I actually think people. It's not to say that there haven't been people who either made up their NDE or in the aftermath of it used it to get attention and that sort of thing. But my experience is that the vast majority of people are very cautious about who they'll disclose to, because the experience is so profound and so meaningful. It goes to their very core, and to disclose to somebody who is cynical, not skeptical, but cynical, is very painful. And so I've seen people start to disclose their NDE, be met with cynicism, and then just withdraw and discontinue, because why expose yourself to that?
Yeah, I mean, we arguably live in a very institutionalized world where we take our cues from larger bodies than us, whether that's the media or the government or the medical profession. Would you say it's like a waiting game in terms of this sort of thing being accepted at that sort of level, or are we just going to be in a situation where potentially the majority of the population know there's something going on, they've got their own anecdotal and well-researched evidence, and yet are somehow almost like in a schizophrenic state in the culture where that's not reflected at the higher levels?
Um, I guess I I believe that there is a paradigm shift in the making, that we're going to not dismiss physicalism, because that and materialism, the idea that everything is physical, because that worldview, that mindset has resulted in so many wonderful things, antibiotics and anesthetic and, just all kinds of things that I wouldn't want to live 100 years ago before these things were developed. And that there's a bigger picture, that perspective can be very helpful in certain kinds of research in certain environments, and it's not the whole story. That there's a bigger story that's part of a really valid, critical, crucial, important part of, and also not the end story. So I believe that that paradigm shift is in the works, and I don't know how the shift will happen. When suddenly the teeter-totter tips and more people really officially accept the best word that I can come up with right now is a post-physicalist worldview. Because right now, all the philosophers who are looking at the different alternate models, the post-physicalist models, there's a lot of controversy. Is this model the best? Is this model the best? So we really don't know. We don't have an answer yet about which model is going to emerge as the best answer that accounts for all the evidence that we have. But it will be a post-physicalist model.
Yeah, and one that doesn't discard the innovations of the materialist model, like you said.
Oh,
yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah, that we still revere. Like I said, I mean, I probably wouldn't be alive today if it weren't for antibiotics. And so I'm very grateful for the materialist, the discoveries that have come out of philosophical materialism. And it's just that that's not all there is. There's something more.
It makes me think of Maslow's pyramid of needs.
Yeah.
If, that materialist worldview is excellent at meeting the bottom of that pyramid, upon which everything else is based. And if we have that, then we have the freedom to explore the higher needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one good way to look at it. Yeah.
I think materialism was necessary during the age of the Enlightenment because it helped separate, church from scientific inquiry. But
Yeah.
now we're at the point where it actually is hampering scientific inquiry. So I think
Yeah.
we should.
Exactly my view. You've voiced it very well. Yeah.
I have a question from Emma. She asks, do you think NDEs will ever be proven to be 100% non-physical in nature, or is there some kind of veil or barrier to finding this out?
That's a great question, because I've really wondered about, that recently Sam Parnia he's a pulmonologist, a physician specializing in pulmonology, the lungs, but he's done research on veridical perception in the hospital. And he's done a couple of really big studies where there were multiple hospitals involved, where they're trying to capture this thing of people, having an NDE and perceiving the visual target that they had planted, and still coming up dry. And there's some speculation that maybe when people are having near-death experiences, they're not paying attention to things that aren't related to their own medical crisis. But actually, we have cases that illustrate that that's not the case. For example, take the Bruce's patient who saw his spaghetti stain. Like, what does that have to do with her medical crisis? Or there's a case where a woman flatlined during surgery. She rises up in the hospital room, and there's a big hanging lamp fixture there, and it's just got like an inch of dust on it. And she's looking at this dust and she's thinking, I've got to tell those nurses, this operating room is not sterile. This lamp needs to be dusted. So what does that have to do with our medical crisis? So people do see things not related to what's going on with their physical body. And a lot of times they even say that it's not they absolutely feel disconnected from their physical body and kind of more interested in what's happening to them and what's going on here. So so there are these different possible explanations for why we haven't captured an NDE in the hospital setting, but what I've come to, just very personally, there's no like evidence for this. This is just a personal, I just wonder if humanity isn't ready yet to really know. Because once we really know, there are a lot of ramifications. Near-death experiencers tend to come back and say that our lives have purpose here. And the most fundamental purpose is to advance in our capacity to love ourselves, love each other. And I define love as a commitment to the well-being of. So if I'm committed to your well-being and mine, that's going to influence everything I do, from my moment-to-moment interactions with people, all the way up to, the decisions I make as a leader of IANs. For somebody else, like a national leader, the decisions they make, the laws and all that stuff, that if everybody is motivated by fostering the well-being of everyone, the world would be a different place. And so I guess I trust spirit that when the time is right, the answer will come, and the indisputable evidence will come. And like I said, that's very much a personal conclusion. It's not based in, the empirical stuff, which is normally where I dance.
I have my own personal question. Have you read Carl Jung? Are you familiar with his
Oh,
work?
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He had a great near-death experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. Do you think maybe what's going on in NDEs might be more like a collective unconscious kind of thing, where people pick up on this vertical information, not necessarily because they literally see something, but it's because their mind is accessing the collective unconscious? And if so, could that mean that the narratives in NDEs are not literally true, but metaphorically true, or convey a metaphorical symbolism?
Well, all I can say is, there are a lot of possibilities that could make logical sense that don't match the subjective experience that people have had now in the millions. So like, let me tell you about an experience I had and come back to, respond to your question. I was learning a counseling technique called induced after death communication. And after I and 3 of my students had gone up to Chicago to train in it, we came back here, and then this is my home office, and we met once a week and practiced on each other for a few weeks before we started doing this with our clients. So one day I was the client and my student Jenny was my counselor. And by this time I'd run out kind of low on dead people that I wanted to communicate with. But I thought of my cousin David, who died shortly after returning from the Vietnam War. And I just had such a warm feeling. I just really loved David. He was such a wonderful person. And I'd always wondered if he'd committed suicide. The circumstances of his death could have been. Um, Although my family always denied that, I wasn't convinced. So I decided I would like to try to connect with David. So we sit down, we do all the preliminaries, we do the procedure. I close my eyes, and there in my mind's eye is David. And I'm just getting chills as I remember this. He's whole and healthy. We don't, our communication isn't words or even thoughts. It's just a look of love. I don't know how to explain it any differently. We look at each other, and there is just this absolute, unconditional, eternal love between us that we communicate back and forth. So while this is happening, suddenly my Uncle Ray, his father, who had just died recently, like David died like 30 years before, but Ray had just died a year or so before. He literally elbowed his way in front of David. This is all happening in my mind's eye. He elbows his way in front of David. He holds out his hand, and in his hand is an hourglass. And it's, hourglass shaped, it's clear glass and meant to sit on a table, but there's no sand inside, which is like curious to me. But again, I know without there being any explicit thought or communication, I know that Ray wants me to call my Aunt Norma, his wife, who's still alive, and tell her that I saw him and this, and it's like a message for her.
Hmm.
So I open my eyes and I tell Jenny what I've just experienced, and I'm like, I was never close to Ray and Norma. They're wonderful people, but we just didn't have they haven't much in common. And I just don't, I of course know them. I grew up, like we went to a Christmas party in the basement of their house one time. I remember that. Um, but that's it. And so I'm gonna like call her and tell her, hi, Aunt Norma, this is your niece Jan, and I just saw Ray in a vision, and he wanted me to tell you about this hourglass thing. Well, anyway, a much longer story, much shorter. I did eventually end up calling her and telling her about this. So when I finished this whole story, I'm like, I have no idea what this means, And she said, I know exactly what it means. I said, you do? She said, yeah. She said, when I was a little girl, we used to go visit my grandmother, and it was so boring. But my grandmother had these two cut crystal vases that she kept on an end table that had a glass shelf. So I would lie down on my back, scoot under the table, and watch the sun glint through these two beautiful cut crystal vases. And she said, when my grandmother died, that's the only thing I wanted from her estate. And she said, I'm looking at them right now. They're on my dining room table. And I said, oh, but what does this have to do with an hourglass? And she said, well, they're two different shapes, but they're both wide. They're both clear glass, no sand inside, obviously, wide at the top, narrow, and then wide at the bottom and sitting on a table. And she said the hourglass is like a form that captures both of them. And she said, nothing you could have told me would convince me more that Ray is waiting for me. Okay, now, did I pull that out of the collective unconscious? I mean, if you want to explain it that way, fine. But I'll tell you that I saw Ray. He showed me this, and it had, a very definite meaning. Oh, and I forgot to tell you one thing. Norma said one of the things Ray knew about me, she said, if we like woke up in the middle of the night and the house was on fire and we had to run out of the house, I would stop and pick up those vases on my way out. She said, they're probably the most precious thing I own. So it was, very meaningful to her. subjectively, I got a message from my Uncle Ray. I can still see him in my mind's eye holding this hourglass. So, I mean, you can explain it in all these different ways, but it's not what it feels like.
I don't think any theory or model can really explain subjective experiences. I mean,
No.
just reductive. It feels reductive.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. Yeah.
I would like to add just from my experience to that a little bit. I don't think that it's the collective unconscious. When I had my near-death experience and I left my body and I was following the foster parents through the hospital, I saw this one wall and I was really fascinated by this wall of the hospital as we were walking past it. While I was in that state, I could see different colors on the wall. And I mean colors that we can't see, like, we as human bodies can't see. And I noticed that the painters had started in the middle of the wall and painted to the right. And then they had come back the next day and started at the other end of the wall and painted to the right to the middle. And the way I knew that was because of the colors. And I understood which colors were there because it was damper on one day. The air was damper on one day. And I knew that they had started at this end because this other color had set because of chemicals in the air. And that's not something that I could understand from the collective unconscious. So I feel like there were things that I saw and noticed at that time that couldn't come from that. Also, the specific conversation that they had, I was able to use and repeat words that I can't even remember to this day because they were medical terms. They were, things like petechia and words like that I didn't understand them, but I was able to repeat them kind of robotically. I actually also, I have a very big speech impediment. And at that time, during repeating that conversation, my speech impediment was not in evidence whatsoever.
Wow.
And that's very specific and unique in and of itself because they thought that I had mental disabilities because I had a very, very heavy speech impediment. I actually still have it. I just speak around it. I have what's called a torus, that it's a little bone that sticks down from the top.
I have that too. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And mine is fairly sizable. So as a child, people couldn't understand me. But briefly for that time period, it wasn't in evidence whatsoever. And
Interesting.
so I feel like that, for me at least, kind of pushes aside a little bit the collective unconscious idea because I wasn't kind of getting, like, I wasn't remembering the people painting the wall. And I feel like if it came from the collective unconscious, I would have remembered them painting the wall. But instead, I was actually reading kind of what the wall was saying, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And it seemed like a pretty personal change for you. Like it wasn't you melting into the entire universe. You were still you.
Yes, during that time period, I was. And even when I did kind of melt into the universe, when I was with the higher power or the divine being, I call it, even during that time frame, there was a part of me that understood that I was seeing as and through the divine being. So I still had that little spark of this is me seeing as and being as. I didn't feel like I did feel like I was completely immersed in it at the same time that I was still aware that I was, the sandy portion seeing as seeing through seeing from.
Yeah. 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 This whole thing about identity and the various, I don't know what word to use, that can happen in that state. I had a mystical experience in which I was up, the light had come, developed amorphous arms and drew me to it, and I was held to the light, and there was a boundary between us. And when I discovered the source of the boundary, which had to do with some of my own thoughts, the boundary dissolved, and the light and I were like conjoined twins. So there was still me and there was still the light, and there was no boundary between us. We were, and it's stuff that you just can't experience in the material world. So it's really kind of hard to explain.
Sure.
Yeah. And recently, an ketamine facilitated counseling session that I did as the client, I had an experience of being one with the darkness that is nothing / everything. And I had no memory of this identity as Jan. Like I just had no sense of that. And yet I returned to that that identity. And that's another thing. I think people think this is kind of like an either or thing. Either you're a localized identity in the afterlife, or you meld into everything and you completely lose your identity. And in my experience, it's both. And that there's a fluidity of moving back and forth between those two, or even experiencing them kind of simultaneously, which sounds kind of like what you did, Sandi. So it's hard to talk about a level of phenomena that don't operate by the same rules as the material world. Our language was developed to navigate this reality, not that, where these rules don't apply.
Yes, I agree with that completely. And I try to express it by saying, literally, we only have one ocean on Earth. There's actually one ocean. And yet we have the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. So people want to say, no, it's not one, but it is actually just one ocean. And yet, if I say the Atlantic, you recognize that, but it's still just one ocean. And if I were to say the Gulf of Mexico, you recognize that, but it's still just one ocean. And the Gulf of Mexico has ocean properties, briny water, all the things that are part of being ocean. The Gulf of Mexico has that. And even if I went further and I said, so I swam in the ocean, in the entire ocean, where? At Siesta Key Beach. So that reduces it down even further. And yet each level of this is recognizable. You could point to it on a map. Okay, here's the Gulf of Mexico. Here's Siesta Key Beach, where I swam in the ocean. And so to me, it's very much like that. Like, yes, the Gulf of Mexico is the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the ocean. It's a recognizable individual part of the ocean, but there is one ocean, only
Mm-hmm.
one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's my attempt to kind of put it into an understandable format for people.
Yeah, I really like that analogy. Yeah. Yeah.
I've had mystical experiences from a meditation called self-inquiry, and it was very, very similar to what you describe on ketamine, that you sort of become nothing on the inside and everything on the outside, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, why do you think that in order to feel that sense of everything, you sort of have to empty yourself out?
Yeah. Well, my best guess, and again, this is this is my theory, not anything that I can say is empirically based, is although there is some pointing to this, that we're, for reasons I don't entirely understand, we're equipped with this brain that limits our consciousness. It enables us to navigate this reality. And in order to access the fullness of our consciousness, we actually have to turn off the brain, or, reduce brain activity, so that the things that normally limit or filter us are dissolved, and we can experience more of what we are. I don't know if we can experience all, I don't know, but we can experience more of what we are. So I think, in evolutionary wise, it makes sense that we would have the brains that limit us. Because if I were going around in that state all the time, I don't know about you, but I couldn't do a thing. I would just be like a puddle. And I'm very grateful to know that condition exists as the ground of being. It was so, I don't know if this was true for you, Rahman, but for me, so freeing. It was, I felt absolute equanimity and freedom in that state. And it was wonderful. And I couldn't live there and do this. And, I do accept that I'm here for a reason, and I'm meant to, live with the filters most of the time.
Theo, you have a background in Buddhist meditation, so I was wondering if you wanted to chime in on this.
Oh yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I like all the ideas coming up around paradox, and two things that appear to be seemingly separate actually just being the same thing. From my experience with meditation and self-inquiry, I think, as far as I can gather, there's a sense in which we can do exercises or psychedelic drugs or this sort of thing, and we can get a very vivid, discrete, memorable experience or memory of sort of a state, I would call it. But I would also throw in the traditions that I'm aware of, underlying all that, the state is always here, and there isn't levels or accelerator pads into different dimensions. It's kind of, this is it. And there's for whatever reason, most of us, some of us, aren't privy to that, or that's not our kind of living day-to-day experience, and then we see maybe there's a potential that can be an experience. So yeah, that would be my take on it.
Yeah. And I really resonate with that. At least the way I resonate with it is that having had that experience, it's now always in my background, my psyche, the background of my psyche. And when I'm getting all wound up about something that's happening at the material level, there's something peaceful about knowing that ultimate reality that exists underneath or fundamental to whatever manifestation reality is taking at the moment. So I experience it as a great gift. Yeah.
Thank you. I had another question relating to therapy. So I have a background in talking therapies. I was trained in Rogerian sort of approach, and also quite an interest in sort of existential ways of looking at things. And you probably know this sort of in our trade, as it were. Often the client is invited to sit with not knowing, or to not feel like we have to have the answers for everything. And obviously, death and the dying process is potentially the most unknown adventure a human could potentially experience. And I'm just wondering, as a therapist, in your practice, how you or do you balance the idea of trying to find out what's going to happen with just the openness that we don't know or that I don't know, and I'm going into it with a very clear, open heart and mind and no sense of how it should look or shouldn't look.
Absolutely. I I have memories of being with clients where what we can do is clarify what's happening right now and what is and the uncertainty of what direction to go. And that is what is. And that there's a certain faith in holding that uncertainty and allowing an answer to emerge somehow and in some way that in most cases can't possibly be predicted. And that's where I think a therapeutic relationship is helpful, because being able to have company when I'm in that place of uncertainty is a source of security. So yeah, absolutely. Mhm. And Rogerian, I'm a co-author of a counseling theories text, and I wrote the chapter on Rogers.
Okay.
And and I loved it because at the end of his life, he was quite agnostic about spiritual things until the end of his life. And his wife, Helen, had experiences on her deathbed that were very impactful to him and really got him thinking that, there's something more than this. So I just love that I had that perspective to be able to bring that to students who read my book.
Yeah, I always think it's a great shame that he didn't live a little bit longer to kind of explore that stuff in a bit more detail, because I think he was on to what we're talking about here. But,
Me too. Me too. Yeah. Yeah. Alas.
Well, I'll move on to more audience questions.
Okay.
Will the Mothman asks, has there been any notable improvements in research methodology the last year or two?
I wouldn't say the last year or two, but back to those hospital studies of veridical perception. The first one that I did back in the mid 80s, we used 8-inch square matting, like matting that you use for a photograph. And I had red, yellow, blue, orange, green, and purple. And then I hired an artist to print one of 6 symbols on these cards and one of 6 numbers. So you could have like a red card with a triangle in the middle and the number 3 in each corner, or a purple card with a circle in the middle and the number 7 in each corner. Or it could be a red one with a star in the middle and the number 2 in each corner. So it was every combination, all these different combinations of 6 colors, 6 symbols, and 6 numbers. So the chances were 1 in 6 times 6 times 6 that if somebody came back from their cardiac arrest and reported what they saw and were accurate, the chances would be very statistically significant that they actually saw what they said they saw. So that was a crude methodology. The most advanced methodology was that Sam Parnia adopted most of this, but not one feature that I'll tell you about. That Bruce Grayson and I did a study about, I don't know, 15 years ago. in the cardiac catheterization lab at the University of Virginia Hospital. And when people go into the cardiac cath lab to have a pacemaker installed, their heart is stopped twice. Once to diagnose the problem and make sure that the pacemaker is the right treatment. And then once the pacemaker is installed, they stop the heart again to make sure the pacemaker is going to work and start it. So with every patient, there are 2 opportunities for near-death experiences. So we did a total of 50 patients, 100 NDEs, and got nobody saw the target. But the target was there was a cabinet near the center of the room, and we had an open laptop computer. And I hired a graphic artist, a computer graphic artist, to create cartoons that were very simple, like a simple line thing of a butterfly flitting around from branch to branch, or a boat sailing across the water. Very simple line cartoons. And with different colored backgrounds again. So I had these, it was this design and this color, and to make it, if they got the right one, what we could say it was statistically significant. So what the methodology was, when somebody was about to have a pacemaker put in, Bruce would get notified in the hospital records. He'd go to the room right before the procedure. He'd get up on a step stool, and he'd reach up and press the button starting the computer. The computer was programmed to, depending on what second it was, like if it was 12:30 and 31 seconds, there was a certain cartoon associated with 31 seconds. We didn't know what it was. We had programmed it, but without knowing that. But we had to program it that way so that we could use the 60 different cartoons. And so he would do this. It would take about 20 seconds for the computer to boot up. So no one ever saw what was being projected on, it was face up, the laptop's open and projecting upward. What it would play the cartoon for like 20 seconds, and then for 10 seconds, it would flash the time and say the time is now 10:03 a.m., 10:03 a.m., 10:03 a.m. And then it would go back to the cartoon for 20 seconds. Then it would go back to the time, and it would do that for the whole time of the procedure. After 2 hours, the computer would automatically turn itself off and record which cartoon it had projected. And it was always the same cartoon through the whole thing. Now, Sam Parney had used this same methodology with computers and some kind of visual. I'm not sure exactly what his visual thing was, but he didn't do the time. And I consider that personally to be a big methodological error, because the big question in the field of near-death studies is, did the NDE actually occur when the person felt like it occurred? Because again, the cynics come in and say, oh, the person constructed the memory afterwards, or, they have some kind of explanation about how it wasn't a real thing. But if a person came back and said, I saw this green cartoon of a boat going across the waves like this, and then it was flashing 10:07 a.m. and then 10:08 a.m., but that's all I remember. And then we go back to the hospital records, and it shows that the person went into cardiac arrest at 10:06 a.m. and they were resuscitated at 10:09. Then, we've got it time stamped. And for me, that is the best methodology. And if we find somebody with a lot of money to set this up in a hospital, I think we, and run it for a long time. And there are other, specifics that would need to happen. I think we we could capture it. But, you know,
Yeah, that sounds like a really good methodology. I hope you guys get the funding.
yeah, me too. If anybody out there listening has a couple $1 million to donate, that would be great. I don't know if it would cost a couple million. I'm just talking off the top of my head.
Jan, I'm aware we've taken up about an hour and a half of your time. I just wanted to check you're okay time-wise.
Yeah, I'm fine time-wise.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If we've got any more questions.
Yeah. Will also asks, have any new correlations been found for those who experience an NDE or not?
Uh,
So like correlations between people who experience an NDE and people who don't.
no, not to my knowledge. One of my kind of stock phrases is that of first of all, near-death experiences, quote unquote, actually occur under a variety of extreme circumstances, but probably the single best circumstance is coming close to death. So, of all the people who survive one of these extreme circumstances, 80 to 90% of people will report that they remember nothing unusual. 10 to 20% will report a near-death experience, which again, they experience their consciousness functioning apart from their physical body, perceiving the material world, perceiving and interacting with beings and environments not of the material world. All the research we've done, the 80 to 90% versus the 10%, we can't find any difference between those people. We can't find differences based on any demographics, the circumstances. We just cannot, we don't know. So my big scientific conclusion is heaven only knows why some people under seemingly identical physical circumstances, one person will report nothing and remembering nothing unusual, the other will report an NDE. We just don't know. Heaven only knows.
Dr. Holden, I think I once remembered reading a study about how people over the age of 60 report less near-death experiences, but I think that's probably due to, memory issues with age rather than like them actually not experiencing NDEs.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that could be. Yeah.
I'm
And so
I'm curious. Sorry. Go
I
ahead,
was just
Jan.
going to say, I was just going to say, Sandy, it looked like you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I would ask actually, what would you say to the people who come into the near-death experience sub and they say, well, doesn't the 80% that don't have near-death experiences prove that they're not real? What would you say to that?
I would say if I went to London and you didn't, would my trip be not real?
Very
You know,
nice.
we just don't know. And, there are cases where people didn't remember an NDE immediately after, but sometime later in their life, something happens, like they find themselves in a situation where suddenly they realize, I've been here before, and it was shown to me, and they suddenly remember their near-death experience. So we don't understand why. We do know from some people's reports that they're told in their NDEs that they're not going to remember certain things from the NDE. They're going to be shown in the NDE. You got that. And because it would just make life too difficult to live if we remembered that particular thing. So uh, you know, it's possible that people who have NDEs have them for some reason that that again, heaven only knows why. They needed that experience and somebody else either didn't need it or for reasons we don't understand would not have benefited from it. Um, that's the best kind of non-empirical hunch I can make.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
We get that a lot. And my general answer is basically, I think that they probably did, but they don't remember it. That, I don't understand as well the argument, just from my personal point of view, why somebody not having one would make them not real. So like I struggle to even understand the concept behind the question personally.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. Me too. I mean, there are all kinds of things that happen where some people have an an experience and others don't, and it doesn't make those who had the experience any less real. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I've never had cancer, but that doesn't make it not real. It's kind of the way that I look at it, So,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And well, I don't even know if this is relevant, uh, but speaking of cancer, um, not everybody who has the genetic propensity for cancer will get it. Like, why is that? We don't entirely know. And even if two people with the genetic propensity are both exposed to a carcinogen, one will get cancer, the other won't. We just don't know. But it doesn't make, as you said, doesn't make any less real the person that got cancer. Yeah.
do we have more questions, Rahman?
Um, yeah, we'll also ask, are there any correlations between the type of NDE experiences?
Like with maybe correlation between the experience and the after effects, because we haven't really talked explicitly about a big chunk of near-death studies, which is the study of the after effects. And we know now that people do have characteristic after effects following the experience. And there is generally speaking, NDEs can be relatively shallow or deep. And shallow one would be just, for example, a gal who I interviewed a few years ago. She was in a car accident where her car rolled over 3 times, and she said the minute the tires left the pavement for the first rollover, she was out of her body, up in the trees, looking down and watching as the car rolled over, and she was thrown from the vehicle and it rolled over and landed on her head, and she was back in her body. And so that was what we would call a relatively shallow, and I don't mean that in a demeaning way at all, because while she was up in the trees, she was in absolute peace. She could feel the wind, she could hear the birds singing, and she could see people rushing to the accident scene. And so it was a very profound experience that changed her, and she had some profound after effects, including one of the less reported, but it happens in a substantial minority of people, electromagnetic after effects, where the electronic things in her vicinity would just go kaflooey, especially if she was emotionally aroused in some way. And when I was interviewing her, I mentioned this after effect. She had not talked about it before. And she's like, oh my gosh, that happens to me. She said, my boyfriend and I they lived together and they just bought a new TV. And he complained that only when she walks in the room, nobody's touching the remote and the volume goes up and down and the TV switches channels. And he said it only happens when you come in the room. So this relatively shallow experience, NDE, had, some profound effects on her. But generally speaking, the deeper the NDE, the more features and the more intense those features, the more intense the after effects. kind of just in general. But it doesn't mean if you have an intense one that you'll have big after effects, or if you have a shallow one, you won't have big after effects, just a tendency for those to be connected. And people change. I like to categorize the after effects as psychological, spiritual, physical, and social. So the psychological ones are loss of fear of death, less concern about fame and fortune and like making money, and more concerned about other people, the well-being of people and the planet and that sort of thing. The spiritual ones are increased interest in spirituality. Like a lot of times people just become like both so focused on reading spiritual stuff and pursuing spiritual stuff and developing extrasensory abilities and those sorts of things that in some corners are called spiritual gifts. The physical ones, sometimes people, often they are more sensitive to environmental things, noise, drugs. They can take half as much as they used to take to get the same effect. Their sleep and eating patterns may change, and other physical kind of their metabolism can change. And there are some miraculous healings. That's a physical, huge physical after effect. And then if you think that you're changed psychologically, spiritually, and physically, that's going to reverberate in your social relationships. So people often have shifts in their friendships. If you're married and you have an NDE, you're at greater risk of divorce just because your values, those values we talked about before, are going to diverge, and those people tend to divorce. People tend to leave organized religion. Sometimes people get more involved in organized religion, but more people leave it because they just find that it isn't big enough to accommodate what they now know. And people change jobs, go from being, in one case, a mafia hitman to a high school teacher because he couldn't stand to shoot anybody anymore. And whenever I tell that story, I always add, I was a high school teacher, and I'm afraid he may still feel the urge to shoot people sometimes. But anyway, so there is that kind of correlation. I don't know if that's what the questioner was after, but
I think what the questioner was getting at is like, is there like more of a general correlation between all near-death experiences? Like, do they all have a life review? Do they all? Yeah, go ahead.
Got it. I think this will answer the question. I've come to a view that Gregory Shushan, who is the leading researcher of NDEs in antiquity, he has come to the same concept, but we've used different words. I use based on Noam Chomsky's linguistics model of deep and surface structure. And what he did, he studied how children acquire language all over the world and found that they acquire it in certain similar ways, no matter what the language is. We all learn nouns first, and then verbs, and then have more and more complex phrases and sentences and that sort of thing. And so he referred to that process, that universal process, as the deep structure of language. And the surface structure is the specific language the person's learning. So I learned English, somebody else learned Spanish, somebody else learned Chinese. We all learned it through the same universal deep structure process, but the surface result is going to be a different language. And this is how I conceptualize near-death experiences. There is a universal level, a deep structure level, and there are two surface structure levels. One is cultural, and then one is individual. Now, the universal level, the deep structure, contains certain universal features that are really found in like indigenous cultures, historical NDEs, just everywhere. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be found in every NDE. But if you look at bunches of them, you see these certain things recurring very frequently. And one of them is movement, rapid movement through some space. In the Western world, it's quite common for people to report that at some point in their NDE, they moved rapidly through a tunnel or a void or some other kind of structure. And in the Eastern world, like in New Zealand, the Maori, which is the indigenous, there's an NDE there where a woman left her body and she moved rapidly over Aotearoa, which is the Maori term for New Zealand, to this one spot on the coast that's considered the jumping off place of souls. So she moved rapidly over through a space, and others move rapidly through space. There's a social environment, so there's relationship with other beings. That's a universal feature. Peace and disconnectedness from the physical body is a universal feature. So anyway, going back, let's say to the moving rapidly through space, the cultural level is that in the Western world, it's more likely to be a tunnel. In the Eastern world, it's, fly over Aotearoa. But even beyond that, there's a personal level. So in the West, where you've got rapid movement through a space, moving through a tunnel, you've got a child who says, then I went really fast through a giant noodle. And you've got a trucker who says, then I sped through this big tailpipe. And then you've got another person who says, I was just moving through this tunnel and the tunnel was light. And then another person will say the tunnel was dark, but there was light at the end. And another person will say the tunnel was shimmering colors. No two tunnels. I've never encountered two tunnels that were exactly alike, but there are a lot of tunnels out there. So the correlations are, that there are these universal, that's where you've got the correlations among NDEs, but then the cultural manifestation or interpretation, and we don't know whether they take cultural forms because the culture influences the experience, or because in the experience a person is likely to describe something once they're awake again, in certain cultural terms, like we're just prepared to see things in a certain way. We don't know which that is, but we do know that there is this cultural surface structure level, and then the individual, where even that is going to be expressed in a unique way by each person.
I've read in Japanese NDEs, they don't tend to have a life review, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Is it zero life reviews?
Yes, that's one of the things Gregory Shushan talks about, that he says what he does is he says the life review is a form of reckoning, that there's some reckoning for how the person lived their life. Now, in other cultures, the reckoning might involve meeting the god of death and looking in the book of the dead of, the record of their life. It's not a life review like we have like we tend to see more often in the West. But that there is the universal culture is some form of reckoning. And again, it's not going to be in none of these experiences are in every NDE. So, but you do find reckoning across cultures and throughout history.
On the question of correlations, could you just briefly touch on, if I die by suicide, am I going to have a hellish NDE? Because that is a frequent question that we get as well. So it would be nice to have someone.
Yeah.
Dr. Long also spoke to it, but it would be nice to have another perspective on that.
You bet. I'm happy to. So, let me get to that answer by dropping back. Remember that everybody who gets through some extreme circumstance, 10%, 10 to 20% will report a near-death experience. Of those who report a near-death experience, somewhere around 80 to 90% report that the experience was dominated by pleasurable feelings, peace, joy, love, connectedness, hope, all those kind of good things. 10 to 20% report an experience that was dominated by distressing feelings. And these can be terror, horror, hopelessness, absolute eternal disconnectedness, isolation, any of those kinds of things. I think I've only heard one NDE that actually involved literally hellfire and brimstone, but it's usually some other form of torment or profound absolute eternal isolation and disconnectedness from everything, which is a particular kind of hell. So once again, we don't know. We have not been able to find any difference between people who have pleasurable and people who have distressing experiences. And everybody who's ever focused on researching distressing experiences has come to the ultimate conclusion that really anybody can have this experience. And that actually corresponds to my very pea-brain understanding of Buddhism, that there are levels of distress that we all have access to. So some people think, oh, well, maybe if you're a bad person, you have a bad NDE. And if you die in a bad way, like through suicide, then you'll have a bad NDE. No. The simple answer is there is no correlation between any circumstances or any history of a person or anything you can think of that enables us to say why this person had a predominantly pleasurable and this person had a predominantly distressing. And so, for example, I mentioned the hitman who became a high school teacher. He had a pleasurable NDE. It was all positive. Conversely, one of the leading researchers of distressing NDEs, Nan Bush, she is a minister, and she had a distressing NDE during childbirth. And it's like, she's like one of the most, she's like bread in your mouth. She's one of the most wonderful people. And, and she had this horribly distressing NDE that set her on a course of researching the phenomenon. So we just don't know. And so some people say, well, gosh, if I can commit suicide and I'm going to have this pleasurable experience. The thing is that if you're a mental health professional, we talked about this, Theo, if you're a mental health professional, you know that there's a certain percentage of people in the population who will attempt suicide. We know that if someone attempts, they're likely to attempt again. So their potential to attempt goes up. But if they attempted and had a near-death experience, the likelihood of them attempting again falls below the average population. And that's not because they were punished. It's because they learned in their NDE that they are loved, that their life has purpose, and that challenging circumstances in life are meant for us to move through them to learn spiritually what we can from those experiences. So when really bad things happen, they don't attempt again. Now, there is another phenomenon where if people who've been in the light, in this, absolutely feel absolutely known, absolutely loved, it is beyond anything anybody can describe from in earthly terms. When they come back, sometimes they have this longing to go back, and it's hard. It's hard to be here knowing that that exists. Yeah, you can relate, right, Sandi? And
Yeah.
so there can be a temptation to, get yourself back there. But and I do know of a couple of cases where maybe the person did commit suicide, but the vast majority of people wouldn't do that because they know that they're here for a reason, and that to kill themselves would be to, undermine their their purpose for being here, which in many cases the NDEer knows that they had a role in planning this lifetime. So, like why drop yourself out of school when, you need that you're here to get the degree, and, even knowing that there's such a better life after school. So they tend to try more to hold that as a promise rather than a deficit that they are, longing for. And it's a challenge. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so I think we should start wrapping this up. I'll ask one last question, which is how do you think NDEs are gonna influence the world?
Well, I hope that the lesson from NDEs that we're here for each of us is a manifestation of the divine. And we, at our core, are love. We are loved. We are love. And that our purpose on earth is to manifest who we really are in this world. And if that message were embraced by, worldwide, we would have a very different world than we have right now. And there would not be the suffering that exists in the world. And I think it exists because people are not aware of who they really are. So I hope that message comes through, and that's why I'm so interested in veridical NDEs, because before people will believe that message, they have to believe that NDEs are a reliable source of information. And yeah.
Very beautiful message.
Thank you.
You're
I can't
welcome.
think of a better way to finish, really. Unless anyone, Sandy, are you going to say something there?
I think that said everything that needed to be said.
Me too.
This has just been such a wonderful exchange. Thank you so much, each one of you. It's been great.
Janet, it has been absolutely lovely to see you again, and thank you so much for coming on. And it's always a delight and a pleasure. Thank you, thank you.
Been wonderful, Dr. Holden. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
You're so
much. We'll put your link to the amazing work that you do at the bottom of the channel so people can check you out if they need to.
okay.
And yeah, thank you so much for your time.